In this video, we'll look at how we measure the intensity of light. So today we're doing power and intensity, the brightness of the light. And we showed this chart before, but just the point, and we made this point last time, was that there is just this magnificently huge range of brightnesses in light in the world. You know, from the 120,000 lux on a bright sunlight down to 0.002 in a starry night, you know, or a little ring light is 2,500 lumens and a Musco light is 5 million lumens, you know. So the point we were making there is that whereas your eye just adjusts to things without you even thinking about it, the camera doesn't know how to do that. And so you got to be aware of how to scale the instruments that you're bringing to a situation to the situation you're in, you know, so that you're not bringing a light like this into a room like this and it doesn't do anything, or vice versa, you know. So the volume is pretty critical. You measure light, there's a bunch of different ways you can measure it. Lumens is a pretty common thing you see now, which is just everything the light's putting out, you know. You'll see lux or foot candles, and that's just the same thing except it's over an area. So like in this amount of space, that's how much light the unit's putting out. And you can use different things to measure the light, like this little light meter right here. A gaffer can walk in with this thing and do all his lighting, and he doesn't need a camera or anything. The cameraman doesn't have to be there, and they figure out everything they need to figure out. You know, if you're doing everything yourself and you can just sort of bring the camera and you don't necessarily need a light meter. You know, the light meter will tell you your f-stop. It'll tell you what to set the camera on. But it will also read out an EV, which can be correlated to lumens. So all this stuff can be calculated. So you can look up how many lumens does a light put out and figure out backwards what that's going to do in a scene, you know. And this app, which I'm going to pull up here in a second, will also shows you, you know, EV for given settings and foot candles, lux, all that stuff. So if I put in the lux at the top there, and I said, you know, I'm in a bright, super sunny day, and it's got 120,000 lux, you know, and then you say, so I say my camera is at a 60th of a second, because I'm shooting 29.97 or 30 frames a second, pretty common. Say it's at 800 ISO. There's an FX9 we're using as a demo camera. Its native low range ISO is 800 ISO, so that's pretty common. So if I'm at 800 ISO, I'm a 60th of a second, and I put in 120,000 lux, my aperture needs to be f80, right? Which is like one atom wide opening. There's nothing that's an f80. So, well, there's way too much light for that, you know. But then it also kind of cool. It shows you ND filters. So I can throw an ND filter on there. If I put an ND9, which is going to stop the light way on down, you know, it's going to be like 1/8, 3 stops, like 1/8 of the light. Oh, now I can shoot it at f3.5. So, voila, I can fix it. You know, and then you can go in and with your meter or with your camera and you can verify all this stuff. But it all makes sense and it all works with the math, and these apps are really helpful. You know, if you want to just sit back ahead of time and figure it all out, you can, you know. And the thing is, if you spend some time doing that, after a while you get used to it and you don't have to be in math class, but you sort of get the hang of it, and then it becomes faster and easier. But these things are still super easy, super helpful, and they'll, you know, this meters the light. I mean, it's not just, you know, you put it up there and it shows you what you got. So, you know, it's a full-blown light meter, and there's a lot of really nice stuff available. So it's pretty handy. Now, what cameras and light meters are measuring typically is middle gray, we call it, 18% gray. This is a gray card, calibration gray card. It's a kind of a standard set of a chip chart, they'll also call it, that goes from white to black. And the middle chip, the middle bar, is 18% gray. That's right in the middle of between white and black. And your camera typically is looking at that to decide how bright your light levels are. So if you're looking at a waveform monitor, for instance, the 50% line is that gray bar in the middle. If you're looking at like your meter on your camera, it's what's right in the middle is going to be that. If you're looking at a histogram meter, it's going to be what's in the middle of that scale. So that's what the machine is typically measuring. It might be an average of sorts, but it's really looking at the middle exposure-wise. There's also something called inverse square law, which is that the brightness, the intensity of light falls off with the inverse of the square of the distance. I sound like the straw man at the end of the Wizard of Oz, but the further you get away, the dimmer the light gets, but it gets dimmer by the square. So if it, twice as far away, it's a quarter, right? So if I go 1 foot away from the light source, I might say, have an arbitrary number, we'll say 100 lux. That's how bright the light is. If I go 2 feet away, 2 squared is 4. So it's 1/4, not half, but 1/4. So now I'm down to 25 lux. If I go 4 feet away, 4 squared is 16. So I have a 16th of the light. Now I'm down to 6 lux. So it's an exponential fall off. So you realize that the further away you get, the less and less and less light you get. A lot of things in photography are exponential like that. Each stop of a camera setting, whether it be an f-stop or a shutter speed, is a doubling, so it's exponential. It gets, the first stop is half, and the next one's a quarter, and the next one's an eighth. So you've got to take that into account anytime you're trying to figure out how bright lights are, or what you're measuring, or what light level you need. So how much light do you need, to get a good exposure? And what is a good exposure? A good exposure, nominally, a good exposure is 18% gray is showing up as 18% gray. You might want a scene where it's all really dark, and that's fine, and you take that into account. But all things being equal, the average scene is right down the middle like that. The white things look white, the dark things look dark. And you certainly should start with that as your goal. You should learn the rules before you break the rules. That is a nominally proper exposure, right? So if you come back and your exposure is really whacked, that's what the client's going to look like, and you're not going to be very successful. So for instance, I was at a political event a few months ago, and I was in a sporting arena, which was 200 feet by 100 feet. It's a very large room. And they wanted the stage to be lit to 100 foot candles. So they walked around with a light meter and said, we need to get 100 foot candles here. Which, and this was, they wanted it bright. This is a real general purpose kind of a lighting situation because TV stations, all kinds of different people are going to come in with different kinds of cameras, and they just want to make sure they cover all their bases. At 800 ISO, at a 60th of a second, that'll give you an f8, which would make sure everything was definitely in focus. So they're just kind of covering their bases. But that's what the client says. The client says that's what we need. Well, our lights, are 100 feet away, hanging up on the ceiling. They're a long ways away, and we've got a light 200 foot wide thing. So the area we're lighting to that level is huge, right? So we have 2 9,000 watt HMIs. That is an extremely bright light. It's a very large light. It's this big around, and it uses a lot of power. It uses 9,000 watts, right? But why? Because if you pull up the specs for that light and you look at it in somewhere in this 30 to 50 degree range of spread, the spot flood will cause the light to be more concentrated or more spread out. And right in here is where you want it. At about 100 feet, which is about where this is, 25, 30 meters, you're getting about, that's 150, that's 80. So right in the middle there is your 100-foot candles. So this light is producing about the right amount of light. A smaller light's not going to do it. So we have 2 of them, and so you're crossing, and so one side of the person's face on stage is going to get 100-foot candles, and the other person's getting 100-foot candles. And there's tweakability. You can be able to do the spot flood and barn doors, and you can be able to make some little tweaks. But basically, we're going to be able to put 100-foot candles on the stage with these 2 9,000-watt HMI lights. So if you go into a shoot like this and they say, this is what we need, and this is how big this room is, then just to get your exposure, just to get that 18% gray, that's the light you need. And that's not even the whole stage, because we're not putting any light out here, right? So we actually had a series of 4,000-watt HMIs. There were a ring of them here, and we were using those to fill in all these side parts, for the audience. So it was actually a lot more light than this. Versus being in a small room where you might just need a few dozen watts of power to light something. In any case, you need to get the exposure. You need to know what your camera settings are, what exposure do you need, how much light do you need to get that exposure. And that's the type of lighting you need to make this happen. And in this case, it's a very large light fixture. So not the largest thing made, but pretty close, pretty close to being up there. Even if you set your camera at f4 instead of f8, and the room was pitch black when you started, you would still need 20 or 30 lux or foot candles, in that ballpark to get that exposure. It's still, less than 100, but you'd still need a lot. And that would, instead of a 9,000-watt HMI, you might need a 2,500-watt HMI, or like a 1,500-watt LED light. That's still a big light. That's like an Aperture 1200, something like that, which is a big, hefty light. And that's, just to get f4 is not a very small stop. Some cameras, if you don't have a great lens, that may be the wide open for that camera. And it's not going to give you a ton of depth of field, which in a live situation, you might want depth of field in case the person's walking around. It's still going to take a lot of light, even at a little bit bigger f-stop. And you could crank your ISO up. There's various things you could do. But now if you were to walk these lights in, say you went 25 feet away, right? Now you're 1/4 of the distance. You're covering a lot. Now you're covering smaller area. You're not covering 200 feet. Now you're covering a much shorter part of the scene. But on this stage, you could get the same amount of light on the stage with a 300-watt LED. So the area and the distance, that inverse square law is allowing you to use much less powerful light to do the same job, brightness-wise. But not over as large of an area. So those are some of the considerations you need to take in when you're trying to figure out how much light am I going to need to get an exposure in a given situation. Click on the next video to continue. New videos drop every couple of days. If you like what you see, like and follow us on our social media channels. And everything is downloadable for free on our website.